There are currently more than 100,000 people on organ donor lists right now here in the United States, and every 8 minutes another person is added to one of those lists. Approximately 48,000 transplants took place in 2024, but the numbers of people saying that they will donate organs continues to be an important topic to look at. Data shows that about 2 in 5 people say that they are registered to donate organs. But how do you get that number higher so that we can potentially help those in need? Pleasure to be joined here in studio by Judd Kessler, professor in the Business Economics and Public Policy Department here at the Wharton School. He has done some research, deeper dive into this, and he joins me here in the studio. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
The focus of this research was around how you can connect with those people, but in part, the vehicle, pun intended, of doing this was through the DMV.
Yeah, so if you have gotten a driver's license in the United States, you almost certainly went to your state's Department of Motor Vehicles and filled out a form. And on that form, kind of by historical accident, we ask people if they want to register as an organ donor.
Right.
And, as you said at the start, there's lots of people who are waiting for a life-saving organ transplant. A lot of people, in particular, waiting for kidneys because you can live for a long time with kidney failure if you get on dialysis. And so these people are waiting for somebody to die in a way that will allow their organs to be made available for transplant. But part of that is the person or their next of kin saying, yes, you can have my organs when I die. And historically, the request to get on this registry of basically saying in advance before death, I would like to be an organ donor, was done at the DMV because the DMV gives you a piece of plastic that you put in your wallet and will probably be on you in the event of an untimely demise. And that can say, that you're an organ donor on it. And for a long time before there were, databases that stored this information, that was going to be how people were kind of identified as donors. Now we have other ways to check whether they're a donor or not, but we still ask people, do you want to register as an organ donor at the DMV?
Right. And so how is the best way then potentially to go about this? Because is the DMV the right spot?
So this is a question that folks have been thinking about for a long time because this list of folks waiting for a life-saving organ transplant is long and, is not getting shorter.
Right.
People are getting transplants, but enough people are being added to the lists that they're not really shrinking. So how folks get asked at the DMV is something that we have thought about for a long time. And one of the things that people thought was, look, only, you said 2 in 5, some estimates put it closer to 50% of people are registered as donors, have said yes at the DMV.
Right.
But if you ask people, do you support organ donation, the rates at which people say, yes, I support organ donation are north of 90%.
Right.
And so the thought was maybe people support organ donation, but we're not asking them to become donors in the right way. And there was a thought for a long time that what we should do is change the way that we ask at the DMV. Now, those who've heard about organ donation before might think, oh, we should do opt-out. Like that's what a lot of countries do. And that is basically assuming everybody's an organ donor. And then the question is, do you want to remove yourself? Turns out that doesn't fly under U.S. law. So, U.S. law, organ donation falls under the Gift Act. And so you have to make an affirmative statement that you want to be a donor.
Right.
So in that case, you basically have a more limited set of options of how to ask. One way is to do what's called an opt-in, where you just give people the option to check a box or sign a form or sign on the form to say, yes, I want to be a donor. And if you leave that section blank, then that's fine because that's just saying I'm not doing it today. Another way you could ask is with a yes/no question, where you say, do you want to be a donor? Yes or no, or maybe no, not at this time. But the idea behind that is, in that case, you have to say something. You have to answer. And theoretically, if you fill out the form at the DMV and you hand it in and you haven't answered that question, the DMV officer could say, actually, you haven't answered question 7. Could you do that? And the thought was for a while that if you asked as a yes/no question, it would force all that 90% of people who say they support to kind of think about it, pay attention, and say yes. And there was some hypothetical data that supported that, and we were curious if that was in fact true.
What I find interesting is that, and you mentioned about, there's support for organ donation in general, north of 90%, but are people recognizing the information as they're going through this process of either doing that yes/no question or opting in?
Yeah, and the possibility that the way you ask the question, might affect how people decide to say yes or no, kind of relies on this idea that the way that we ask kind of conveys something or communicates something or gets people to think carefully about the decision in a way that they would not otherwise do it. And the prior research that I mentioned had in fact found if you ask people in a hypothetical situation, you've moved to a new state, the default is, there's no organ, you're not an organ donor unless you opt in. Do you want to opt in?
Yeah.
In that data, they found it was, about 42%, kind of close to the number that we get now when you ask people that way. But in their hypothetical study, if you asked, would you like to be a donor? Yes, no. You're in a state that doesn't have a opt-in, but has a yes/no question. What do you want to do now? They found that the rate skyrocketed. It was like in the high 70s if you made them say yes or no.
Right.
And so then that led us to think, oh wow, like that would be great if it worked like that in practice when people's real organs were at stake. And a lot of states, based, I think, in part on that research, had kind of done legislation to change the way that the question was asked at the DMV. And so then we decided, all right, we're going to test this out. We're going to look at the changes that have been made in practice, and we're going to do a more controlled experiment to see if the question wording matters.
And the results were?
Not great for folks who thought that the question wording would be important. So it turns out that there's no effect. That's the top line result. We do not find any effect when it's real organ donor registration decisions.
Right.
We don't find any effect of the question wording. And we did this in two different ways. The first way was designing kind of front-end interface for the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles. So subjects would come into the laboratory. This I did when I started this project a long time. Started when I was still a PhD student at Harvard. So they'd come into the lab at Harvard, and they knew that they needed the last four digits of their social. They knew they needed their Massachusetts ID number, but they didn't know that it was about organ donation. So they show up, and then we say, okay, you're going to log into the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles. You're going to see your organ and tissue donor status, and then you're going to have the chance to change it if you want.
Sure.
But we built a front end that let us change the specific way in which the question was asked. So, you got the same kind of information that was on the Massachusetts website, but when you had a chance to decide if you wanted to register, we framed it either as a checkbox, an opt-in, or as a yes/no to see, randomly assigned whether that would make a difference.
What do you think then this tells us about what we need to do around organ donation?
So the fact that our study revealed that it didn't matter how you asked was kind of disappointing to the question framing mattering. And I should say, when we looked at the state data, we found the same thing. So when California changed their wording on the form, and when New York changed the wording on the form, it did not lead to an increase in donations when they went from opt-in to yes/no. And we compared them to other states to kind of do a kind of fair comparison over time, and did the best methods we could with that data and found no effect. But what was interesting and what was reassuring in our study is that folks came in, some of whom had already registered as donors, some of whom had not registered. So we got to see both groups. And in our study, you got asked, do you want to change your donor status? And so you could change it in either direction. If you were already a donor, you could say, you know what, I thought more about it and I actually don't want to be a donor anymore.
Right.
Or if you weren't a donor, you could say, oh, you know what, I think I will register. And one of the things we found is that folks were dramatically, 30 times more likely to add themselves to the registry than remove themselves.
Right.
And so, what that meant to us was that, look, when you say you want to be an organ donor, it's kind of, you can reflect on it and change your mind. And there were, I think 2 people out of the, few hundred who decided they wanted to remove themselves. But that kind of decision is stickier. Like deciding you want to be an organ donor, it's like something that you do and you're unlikely to change your mind. But if you're not a donor, you may not have thought carefully about it when you were first asked. You might have been rushing through at the DMV. You might have or your position might have changed. You might have heard a story about somebody who got a life-saving organ transplant, but you haven't been back to the DMV or been asked about it. And so, just by asking again, we netted, many, many more donors because we were just giving them another chance to reflect their preferences.
Judd, great to talk to you. Great work. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Judd Kessler, professor in business economics and public policy here at the Wharton School.